Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Profoto. Profoto, the light-shaping company, renowned for its high-end lighting equipment used by the world's best photographers and brands, has now expanded into the world of cinematography with uncompromising speed of use and limitless creativity. The L1600D is a high-output with no ballast LED light. Its dual mount makes it compatible with 50-plus Profoto modifiers and hundreds of Bowen's mount modifiers, making it a breakthrough product for cinematographers and gaffers seeking speed and efficiency on set with the highest degree of creative light-shaping possibilities. This episode is sponsored by Aperture, a premier manufacturer of LED lighting with the industry's greatest variety of fixtures for your complete lighting needs. Aperture recently announced the new Storm family of lights. With LED white light quality that matches natural daylight and classic tungsten bulbs, plus extreme low-end dimming while maintaining color quality. Discover more about the new Storm lights and the complete Aperture lighting ecosystem at aperture.com. Today we're speaking with a visual effects artist who has seen a lot of changes in this field, starting with the early optical effects to the CGI today. His credits are many and include The Abyss, The Avengers, Age of Ultron, and Deadpool and Wolverine. We're pleased to welcome Jon Alexander. Jon, thank you for doing this.
Yeah, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
We'd love to start with our question. How did you get to where you are today? Is this something you always wanted to do, or did you go down another path and then find it? Tell us your story.
I'd like to think that the artistic bent's a bit genetic, but both my parents were orphaned when they were very young, so I don't really have much family knowledge. And I grew up in Ohio. I did spend a good bit of my my college years in New York, so my film theater education is skewed a bit more that way. But my mom was an incredible singer. My dad was a bit of a wild child, and he didn't start to tell me much of his history until after I got out of college and he wasn't paying my rent anymore and he felt we could be friends. He didn't have to be a dad anymore. But he learned printing in high school in Toledo and got a job at the Toledo Museum of Art as a fine art printer. So if you were going to have a Matisse or a Paul Klee exhibit, they would make prints that they could sell. And that's what my dad did. They had some connection to the New York Metropolitan Museum. So this was before World War II, he went over there, and this is where it gets a little sketchy for me because it sounded like he had quite a life over there. It was an incredible young artistic community at the time. But again, he worked as a printer making lithographs. He also helped out photographers, if they were going to make 100 prints of what it was, he would help them out do that. And so he had and just bumped into folks. I remember we were having some random talk at home one time, and I mentioned he had bumped into Ansel Adams in this time, and he mentioned just where we were talking, and he said, "Oh yeah, I remember helping him out on some stuff. I think I got one of his prints in the garage." I'm like, "Dad," it's like, come on. But he was leaned that way. I didn't hear much about what happened during the Second World. He just started to open up a little bit about that. And unfortunately, he died suddenly of a heart attack. So a lot of these great stories that would have come from his artistic side, I never, just didn't get to hear. All that being said, it's because they were brought up in foster homes and during the Depression, as far as I was concerned, they wanted me to get a job that would be solid. And I was really good in science. And so they were leading me into being an engineer. And unfortunately, also at the time, the Vietnam War was kind of going on, and there was a draft. And my dad said, pretty poor. I can't get you out of this. But he said, if you're going to go in, it'd be better if you went as an officer. So I applied and got into the Air Force Academy. And I mentioned this because it informed me later about how to deal with people. Anyway, I was at the induction, or one of the induction things down at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and the second lieutenant who had graduated from the Air Force Academy a year before was showing us the ropes and doing this, and you need to do that. And we were just someplace random, and this master sergeant walked by, guy maybe mid-50s, and gives the second lieutenant, who got out of the Air Force Academy the year before and was probably 23, gave him a crisp salute and just went on. And the second lieutenant said, okay, you saw what happened there, and I outrank him, but he knows how to do everything. And he is the guy that if I want to, I think this, he said the sergeant was in charge of the motor pool. So if I can't go in there and do anything with those, the motors, but he can, and he has all the people that do that stuff. And he said, honestly, he goes, I'm kind of in the cat herding mode. It's like I can tell them to do things, but they have to respect me. They can't say no, but they will do it. So I took that really to heart. I also took to heart the fact that these sergeants are the guys who are going to kind of do lots of the hands-on work. And going to the film world, I'm always been kind of the sergeant. I guarantee you there is no image that I can't fix. You got the time and the money, I'm your guy. But I did take that into account as I went along. And that was one of the things I loved about ILM. They really did seem to be very kind of in that mode, really respecting the folks, knowing that like Dennis Murin, good friend, and and John Knoll, good friend, they can do a lot, but they can't do everything. And so they rely on me and then all the folks that I go to. But anyway, so I washed out of the Air Force Academy, and part of that because the thing was winding down. But I then was in engineering, and because of what my parents said, they wanted me to, get a good job, and making movies was not kind of the thing. And my dad had a real artistic bent. He didn't see that as a good career. But I kept changing my mind. I started in aeronautical engineering, was in chem engineering, actually did a short internship at a place called Owens, Illinois, where I learned a bit about lenses because I make a lot of glass. And I got to the point where I was about 4 years into college. My dad said, John, you seem like you're going to be a professional student. You keep changing, majors, and you're looking around. And I never, I kind of planned for 4 years. I didn't plan for ever. So you're kind of on your own. This was back when tuition was affordable. So I said, okay, great. That then allowed me to just kind of explore stuff. And he said, one of the thing I kept changing universities, and not the wisest thing to do because change universities, you lose credits and blah, blah, blah. He said, why don't you go to Ohio State? Because it's a massive college and they have all the different disciplines there. And so I did. And they had a cinema department. And I don't know if you know anything about Ohio State, but in American football, it's a big thing. And it's actually, I imagine for some of the football players there, it's a bit of a step down facility-wise to go to the NFL because they just have everything. And including
Wow.
and I don't know if they still do this, but at the time, they would have students help film the games. And this was more of the game film stuff, just so that the coaches could look at stuff in the past. And I mentioned this only because they had incredible amount of money. And so our film department, and we're not USC, although we did have some USC professors that they somehow lured over there, but we had Area 16s, and they had an Oxbury animation stand, and we were not. And the deal was during the season, they would hire the students to go and shoot these films, and this was back in film time, and they would give you enough film so that it would cover, in theory, the time for the whole game. Now, football, it's 60 minutes is like when the clock runs. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in between. But so what we would do is we would hit the button as soon as they hike the ball, and then we would stop as soon as the bell rings. So we had, in theory, enough to do it. And there were, I think, about 8 teams, and you were given an assignment. It could be like this end of the field, or, this person if they were the star. But that meant that and there were 2-man teams. One would load and one would shoot, and we just switched back and forth on quarters. They only wanted the full reels back. So we were in the mode of if, something was going on our end of the field and it took a minute and then it all went to the other end of the field, well, we would reload really fast, and we got to keep the short end. So all my films were made of things that were left over from the football team. But anyway, then my dad, in his infinite wisdom, when I graduated, he said, John, they're not making a lot of films in Ohio, so you ought to go someplace where they do that. And so I moved to Los Angeles. And again, in my infinite wisdom, I moved out there in 1980 when there was an actor's strike going on. So nobody was working, and this was back in the time where you just had to make phone calls and you could send your resume in. I also like to write a lot, and I thought I was fairly clever at it. So I wrote a cover letter. I didn't have a lot of stuff to put on my resume. There were things that were shot in Ohio, like Brubaker, but they would come in and out and you could help out on the crews, but I just didn't have much on my resume. But I sent things around, and one of the fortunate things was that because nobody was working, and producers and such they needed things to fill their time or their assistants. So I got a lot of interviews. I got really good at doing interviews. And that gave me some opportunities later on for connections to that. And I won't go off on that rabbit hole. But anyway, one of the places that I saw was a place called Calico Creations. It was a little non-union place. It was folks that, there were like 6 people there. They had worked at Filmation, which is Saturday morning cartoons. And then they decided to start their own place. And they were looking for a camera operator to help out. And that's pretty high up in the pecking order in Hollywood. But again, it was a non-union place. And this was back in the time when it was really hard to get a union job unless you knew somebody. So I went there with no false aspirations that I was going to get a job, but I was really good at interviews by that point because I talked to a lot of folks. And I walk in, and Tom Burton, one of the owners, looked at me and goes, "Okay, so this is a little weird, but I'm going to give you a test." And he gave me some lineup sheets for an animation stand. He goes, "Go in and, here's the test and here's the art, and I want you to do this." And it was actually an easier test than I had taken for my animation class back at Ohio State. And it was exactly the same optical stand. So I did that, and they had a ProStar, which was exactly like the ProStar we had back at Ohio State. And I ran my test out, and I showed it to him, and he goes, "You're hired." And I was like dumbfounded because it was like, well, I've been practicing all my interviews, and you just want to hire me. He said, "I'll be honest." He goes, "You were the 7th person that has come here looking for this job, and we know the camera operators, pretty good place to start." He said, "You're the first person that had actually run the camera, and I'm just tired of doing interviews." So that's how I got my foot in the door. Then they were doing a series of, they did mainly commercial work, but this is all stuff that we were shooting on film. And at the time, people wanted, it was a lot of graphics. At the time, people wanted a lot of the look of the stuff that was in 2001. Bob Abel was the big guy that everybody wanted to work with. But, so we were kind of competing for a similar sort of stuff. Anyway, a lot of the 2001 stuff was like that slit scan things. And I listened to, I know you talked to John Knoll a bit about the slit scan stuff, but that requires computers. And going back to my wandering college career in all the engineering things, I actually had picked up a bit of programming. And so we were doing some really early, this was actually before the first Macs or the IBM PCs came out. So it was a lot of more machine tool type of programming. Record things onto tapes and put them in, and things would just basically run like machine tools. Anyway, they were looking around for a motion control system that could run this animation stand. And there was a company in Atlanta, I can't remember the name of it, that had a 4-axis system, and they wanted $100,000 for it. But the problem was the whole budget for this thing for WNEW was only $400,000. So it's like, well, that makes no sense. But it was, again, a small community at that time doing effects and these type of animations, and word got around. And this fellow, Bill Tondro, just walked in the door one day, and he said, "I've got this 8-axis system that I'll sell to you for $10,000. And my boss threw him out because he thought, well, this is just a scam. And then my boss's brother, Rob, said, well, I think I cannot remember the company that maybe it was Pacific Ocean Post or something, but Bill had a space down at one of the animation companies that they let him, kind of set up and work at. And so my boss, Tom's brother, Rob, said, well, why don't we go down and visit him, and see, because if he's got a working thing and we're set, because this would be perfect. And it doesn't make any common sense, but that we could get something for $8,000 or for $10,000. And in worst case, then we can have lunch at the beach. So I went down there, and it turned out that Bill Tondro was actually a really poor salesman, but brilliant in the motion control side. So we got this 8-axis Tondro system, and those eventually evolved into Cooper control systems, and those kind of became the standard. Bill eventually won a full-on Oscar, not just one of the technical ones, but a statue for that. So at Calico, then Lee Mann, who owned the place, said, well, he lured Bill to come there with the idea that he could do his development, and then and he could work there rather than wherever he was working down in Santa Monica. And then we would just get all the updates. So I got really good on this Tondro system, and we were doing slit scans, and eventually Bob Abel stole Bill away. And so jump to about 1986 and Howard the Duck. And how's that for a start for my film career? And that was going on in ILM, and ILM had settled in. They had motion control systems that Jerry Jeffers and Dykstra had, kind of sorted out. But they weren't as good as what Bill's system was. And Bill's system was getting a reputation around. It was easier to use, easier to program, much more flexible. It was pretty unlimited in the number of axes you could have. And so they were upgrading a bunch of their systems to these Tondro systems. And they just were looking for other Tondro operators. And there weren't many of us around. And Bill was up there, and they asked, do you know anybody else? And he knew my name. And so they gave me a call. And it was, it wasn't that long after Jedi, but it still was ILM, and it had it wasn't like the religion that it has become out of that, but it was, obviously a great place to work. So Bill suggested me and Rob Burton, another guy, brother that I had worked with down in Calico, and they called me up, and that's how I got the job there. But because I worked at Calico, where we would do all sorts of things. We were doing about 50 commercials a year. And like I say, Lee Mann, the owner, he was clever. He hated hiring folks. So he would find things for us to do in the interim. If we didn't have something, like I was camera operator, maybe I would help build sets. And so I got really good. And if we were, we were early on the motion control stuff for cameras. So I got really good at just doing that. Bill was kind of tight about how his system interacted with the drivers and the steppers, but he was really open to the front end. So there's a lot of opportunity to do programming. But so I was an attractive choice for ILM since they were changing over, and I knew everything about slit scans and the stuff that was like the 2001 and things that they were going to do. So that's my long-winded explanation about how I got to ILM.
So when you started out, though, were visual effects, well, they were done in a very different way than they are today, right?
Yes.
I mean, wasn't it? It was much more physical, and you were on an optical printer. Tell us more.
Eventually. So I started out in animation, and those were motion control things. There was motion control stuff out on the stages there, and it was all practical models. One interesting thing about Howard the Duck, so one of the things we used to do for optical was help make mats. And in Howard the Duck, in some of the opening sequences, there's a place where Howard is sitting in his apartment, and he gets hit by this beam and gets pulled through the walls. And it was a practical set. And I would say the set was maybe about 6 feet tall or something. It was pretty good size. And Howard's puppet was sitting on a little practical sofa. But it does get pulled through the walls, and that was done on wires. So they put the sofa on wires, and they just said action, and off he went. The problem was then you saw the wires, and in lighting, there's a lot of things you can, get the lights in the right spot, and the wires, if they're thin enough, they just disappear. Well, there was a lot of dust and a lot of whatever, and the lighting was good for what it was, but the wires was just there. So at that time, what we used to do is we could chase mats around so that we have kind of a G mat, and then in optical, when we're going to do the composite, you would just kind of blur out that section, and you could put some diffusion on it. And we had all sorts of diffusions. We had, even down to using sandwich bags or, whatever we could come up with just to break it up and to make it look good. And we tried all sorts of things and just could not make it disappear. They were just kind of too big for the scale of what it was. And Pixar was still there when I got there. They had been sold, but they were kind of getting on their way out. But Pixar was still there, and they were kind of on their way out. But there was not the reason George was selling them off is there was not an obvious revenue source for that technology at the time. They had used it a little bit, but he also was going through a horrible divorce and dividing up assets, that sort of stuff. So we were trying to figure out how to get rid of these wires in there. And the folks from Pixar came over, and they basically did a wire removal, which is almost an entrance level thing in CG now, where they could go in and they could copy over an earlier frame, or there was a thing that Pixar had developed called layer paint, which was still around, and it was very, very simplistic, but it didn't require kind of fudging the focus, didn't require just kind of blurring out things. They actually were, like I say, again, it's a wire removal today that would be an entrance level CG thing. And I remember seeing at the dailies, and best what we could do on the camera side was, like I say, to kind of make it look a bit out of focus or just kind of blur out a section. And it kind of looked like what it was. But I remember sitting in the dailies, and that was kind of my stuff. I working with optical and making these mats, and here's our version of it. And then the Pixar folks came over and they showed their version, and it was perfect. And I remember sitting there, Willard Hype was the director, and George was there, and Pixar folks were explaining what it was. And I remember George saying, well, this just changes everything. This is you could see how it would extrapolate out into the world that we're in right now. But I always like to bring that up because nobody thinks of Howard the Duck as being particularly groundbreaking on the technical side. But that was the first wire removal that I saw.
And that was George Lucas, when you say George.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Sorry. Yes. He was always really pretty wonderful about. It was never a Mr. Lucas thing. So anyway.
It must be nice being in a field that's constantly growing, because visual effects is constantly finding new ways to do the same things, but better.
And Howard was a fun movie to work on just because there still was a lot of money around, the Jedi money or whatever, and this was just George's place. And George always referred to himself as the benevolent dictator. We were going to do what he did, but and he really loved technology. And so something like all the things that I got involved in were because of him. And he obviously did well with the franchise. There were a lot of things that just don't make sense on the effects side to spend money as far as exploring things, but he did allow us to do that. And again, I was never in the budget meetings for that. Always was more the group that had ideas about stuff, but he was just pretty wonderful. Anyway, so that's my start there. And then you mentioned about optical. So I was in animation for a bit and did do some split scans for things. And I mentioned that only because the split scans now are what in CG you would do in effects, that you can do all sorts of smoke things. And it's very, I wouldn't say, well, it's easy. It's math now. It's not, and back then it was all physics and chemistry. We were trying to do something that would show up on a piece of film. And so you had to have your lights right, and you had and things were only going to move a certain way. So it's just certainly a different time. And but George was always great about letting us try things. And one of the things that they thought would be cool was to do a motion control optical printer. And that's really where I came into my own at that company. The optical department was set up by Robbie Blaylock and back on the original Star Wars stuff. And some of those guys were still around in there. And they had really taken optical to its pinnacle. But it was kind of like at that time when we're switching over to CG, it's kind of like, well, we have the best horse and buggy that you could ever imagine, but some guy's making a car in the other room. So yeah, we on the film side, and I loved on one aspect of working on film because it's much more what you see in real life, and then there's but we're in the physical world, and now we're in the math world. But anyway, they decided to get an optical printer. Mechanical Concepts was the company that put it together, and Jerry Jeffers was the guy that did the original programming so that it would run. And unfortunately, when it came in, it didn't actually work. And part of that problem was first thing that Mechanical Concept did, and they were great about coming back and trying to remake things. But there was a fellow at ILM called Udo Pompel who was this machinist, and they made everything there. They made their tracks. It wasn't like you could buy a lot of the stuff off the shelf. And so they had a pretty incredible machinist group to the point even of making cameras, like for jumping ahead to Roger Rabbit, the VistaVision cameras, because there weren't enough of them around. So Udo and I came in, and Jerry's stuff on the motion control side wasn't working, but he wasn't as kind of tuned in as Bill Townder was. So I talked to Bill about borrowing one of his setups because he was upgrading things and taking one, and I put it on the printer. And that thing had 22 motors on it. So but it also could do zooms. And that was pretty unheard of for optical printers at the time. You could do a zoom on an optical printer, but it was by hand. So you could kind of inch on things. And if you could imagine for some of the, shots we were doing, there could be 50 elements, and you're making all the different pieces to those elements. You have to put them all back together. If you're going to try to do a zoom on something after the fact, yeah, in theory you could do it, but it would take you years. And this all of a sudden then allowed us to do things that we hadn't done before. On the practical side, as practical models, for example, we always were really into making sure we had lens matches. So if they shot something on a 70 out on, location, if we're going to put some model in there, we're going to shoot 70 on stage. And ideally with the same lens, exactly, so that all the aberrations and everything just kind of matched up. And we had 100-foot tracks because that was kind of the size of the building. But all of a sudden, this printer, which had a 4:1 zoom ratio, those tracks became 400 feet because I could add a zoom after the fact to something. And then these models, and the problem with making models is that people's hands are only so small. And so if you can only use so much detail down. So very often we would make multiple sizes of models, and just depending on like what the requirements were for the show. But then because now I could add, the zooms are just make it smaller. All of a sudden now instead of having to make 3 models, you can make 1. And then also ILM is an interesting place where it used to be part of the slough, and then it was a garbage dump and again landfill, and then they built just places for like machine shops or auto shops. It was just a light industry sort of a place. So it's things on slabs. And the problem there was when the tide came in, everything would kind of bend a little bit. So if you were shooting on these 100-foot tracks and they would shoot like a beauty pass, right? So you get the lighting all right. But then there would be all these interior lights, and those would be just little LEDs or fiber optics or whatever. Well, you turn off all the beauty lights and then do another pass with just these. So you could have 5 or 6 passes. You could have a key light that you wanted, or maybe there was an explosion that was going to go on. So but everything had to match up. And if they didn't do it quick enough over time and the tide was, moving, you would get these kind of warps. And they would, unfortunately, back at the time with film, you could do kind of quick black and white tests and stuff, but you really wouldn't know what you got till the next day after it came back from the rant or from the lab. And so, but what this printer could do, and it was accurate, it was incredibly accurate. It's down to a 10,000th of an inch because it really was made like a machine tool, like a lathe. And and Udo is just perfect at kind of changing out alloys so that when things heated up, they, didn't expand, or things that could expand, and things rotate and they would come back to the same point. And so I could fix things like that. I did a kind of reverse projection where I could look at, an optical printer, there's a camera, and then there are 2 we call projectors looking at that camera. And basically all you're doing is duplicating a little piece of film. That's the other problem, is that a 35 millimeter image is only going to be about the size of a quarter, but that's going to get projected onto a screen that could be 50 feet across. And so there's no wiggle room there as far as accuracy goes if you're going to do multiple passes on things.
So just to explain, so people who are listening can get more from this, because possibly a lot of people haven't had any experience with optical visual effects. You've got the piece of film that maybe was shot originally, and then you want to put a ball in it to go through. So you shoot a pass of the ball, and then you run it through a very accurate printer with the the step-by-step frame, holding the frames one by one, and then you're re-exposing it.
Yes. So it's multiple passes. And so we would get some, wonderful background plate from somebody like Roger. And then we would start putting things in front of it. And if there could be an explosion pass, we could have a critter running through it from CG, or we could have a model back in the days. But it meant that you were going to do, and it's kind of like doing a collage, that you cut out, you have a background and you cut out a piece that you want to kind of paint over or put over that, and then you do another one. And we're very cognizant about lighting between the different pieces. But it really, if you think about it more as about making a collage, but just at 24 frames a second, it's maybe an easier way to perceive it. And again, only going back to this small size of things, it's just so unforgiving. I mean, we did a lot of work with Kodak just because we were a great source for them to test things on. Their major thing for making emulsions was for just popular use, people doing there's things at home, whatever, but that never really tested the emulsions, and not to the extent that we would, in going multiple generations. If you make a copy, well, in the old days before digital, if you made a copy of a copy, well, every time it gets a little bit softer. And so that was kind of one of the reasons also why they originally went with VistaVision as far as shooting at ILM, because that's twice the size of what the final 35 millimeter film is going to be. So we could make all our elements, do all our composites, and then we would actually be reducing it by half. And things kind of look like they get sharper when they go smaller. But Kodak was great to work with. And gosh, we got into the weeds with grain size and different emulsions and different dyes, and went down a whole other path with perfs because we needed perfs to be perfect. We did do some work with Fuji. Their emulsions were a bit more garish, but their perfs were perfect. Kodak was really wonderful with their emulsions and all the color blends. It just was pretty incredible, but their perfs kind of sucked. So anyway, there's just things that we worked with those folks along the way to try to, on the film side, to try to perfect. And by the time the Vision films came around in the 90s, going back, sorry, I do kind of tend to wander, but going back to just shooting like blue screen, and the reason they shot blue screen was because the blue record was horrible. Blue's hard to capture as far as the color goes. And so those little silver halides, on a piece of color film, there's 3 layers, and they're going to capture the red, green, or blue, or the YCMs, or the cyan, yellow, and magentas. But we're into chemistry and physics. And if the light's not bright enough, the silver halides just don't change. And if it's too bright, then I'm going down a rabbit hole here. My point is just that we had done a lot of work with Kodak over the years to try to also work on things like that, just getting better emulsions, better color representation. To me, the amazing thing about people is how good their eyes are. And that's why I listened to some of your other podcasts, and you talk about, things just not kind of looking right. It's because you're just trained that way. Nature made us so that we could survive. And we're very good at knowing what looks real and what doesn't look real. And people like, myself or Roger in particular, you look at something and you know how to fix it. Normal people don't, but that's like and especially my life has been just trying to fix things that don't look right, but you kind of can't perceive why. It's not obvious why they're not correct. Anyway.
Yeah.
But yeah, so and the printer was just a fabulous piece of technology that we could do all sorts of stuff with. And we could add shakes after the fact just to make things cut in better. We were working on...
Can you describe some shots of specific shots in specific films, just so we have a sort of...
were done optically. Yeah.
Right. So there was a film called Inner Space that Dennis Muren was the effects soup on. And there's a scene in there where Martin Short is running along, and Dennis Quaid has been made miniature, and he's in this little capsule that's inside Martin Short. And so in our work, we're going back and forth where there's a shot of him running along the sidewalk, and then we cut to inside. And when they cut it together, I mean, all our stuff was done on these motion control stages, and in theory, they could add some shake out there, but it's really dangerous at that point, because if you too much or too little, and this was still in film days, and so the ideal thing was to kind of not. And the printer had come along, and actually I used Interspace because that's the first movie that we did on there that actually elements that I made or composites that I made actually came out onto a film. But anyway, so Dennis wanted it to look like, when we cut to the interior inside of Martin's body, that it looked like it had a similar sort of bounce to it. And that's all. So kind of a nothing burger as far as today's things go. But at the time, in post, while you're doing a composite, add an overall shake and then different types of shake. There was another movie, I'm spacing on name. I want to say it was Alive. No, it wasn't. It wasn't Alive, but it was it was about firefighters in planes. And John Goodson was in it, and we had some shots where they shot a practical thing out on a set in a warehouse where they had little trees on fire, and they had a truck going along, and the camera was on that. Then what we were going to do were cut to shots where Richard Dreyfuss or John Goodman were in the cockpits. And they had them on a gimbal, so they were kind of rolling them around, but they wanted it to look more dangerous. And I don't know if you've ever seen, I mean, the practical ones, when those guys fly into the fires, the thing just shakes like crazy. So we did all the comps, and it was just another one that all I was doing was adding the shake to it. And the reason I bring up that story, Joe Johnson was wrangling the effects for this particular movie for this sequence, and we were sitting in nightlies, and I had on the printer, I had done a bunch of these different shakes, and I could do little, whatever, a lot, and I could just run tons of them at a time for the composites. And we were stepping through, and all of a sudden, the room kind of started shaking, the speakers kind of shaking, and it was the Loma Prieta earthquake. And Joe was so focused on the screen, and we were in one of the screening rooms at ILM, that he goes, "No, that's it, that's perfect, that's the one." And so I go, like, "Joe, there's an earthquake going on, we got to get out of here."
I think also one thing that you've said in some interviews, which is really interesting, is back in those days when you were working optically and you had very many different layers that you were working with, then if it didn't work, you went back and you started all over again. Today with CGI, you just delete and you undo, and then you're at least just back one step instead of going back the whole way.
Oh no, yeah, absolutely. And boy, I don't imagine there's a camera or optical operator that you come across that won't tell you a story about they worked on some composite, and it could take hours. We did a thing for a simulator ride called Star Tours at Disneyland, and there was a sequence in it that had what we call these ice droids, and we were trying to basically recreate a look on a ride that looked like Star Wars. And it took 24 hours just to make the elements for it.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the extreme version of it. But everybody that's an operator's got this thing where I did a composite. It took me like 6 hours to do all this stuff. And so then they, unload the camera, and they take the magazine into a dark room, and then they open up the thing and they go to put it in the can, and then they turned the light on and forgot to put the top on the can. So whatever work they did was just gone.
Ruined.
And yes, so today if I make a mistake, I hit undo, and we're back to going again. So there was a real artistry and a certain choreography that went on, and to the point where we had we call them like Matt's ass of magenta. It'd be like a 0.025 or something like that we would put on with maybe a yellow to get some color tweak that we were going to do. But if you didn't put them in exactly the same order from the time you did the wedge to when you were going to do the composite, it wouldn't look the same. So there was an incredible choreography that had to happen, and you had to be very anal retentive about how you put these things together, or it just wouldn't show up. So there's a ton of stuff that I like about compositing and computer graphics, but it's so simple compared to the way it used to be on film.
Yeah, so I've been basically techniques you've been talking about. It's the same as were used on 2001, right? Because I remember talking to one of the effects guys that did the discovery of the monolith, and he said he did 25 passes, and each pass it had to do 25 passes on the same piece of negative, and you get to number 25, and the power would cut out or something. It means the whole lot would have been gone, which might have been 2 or 3 days' work.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you're basically talking about the same systems as used for that film, yeah?
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. Exactly the same sort of thing. And you just were, and you're up against physics and chemistry as opposed to math. And, electricity goes out. Well, even on the printers, once you started, you couldn't stop because they would kind of cool down. And, we're talking about this incredible accuracy that had to happen when you're basically recreating something the size of a quarter. Yeah, that's where matte lines come from. And so, yeah, there's just a physicality to it that was pretty incredible. But to me, though, on the plus side about film, dealing with the way that folks, Kodak in particular, put all their emotions together, it's much more accurate to our color perception than where we've gotten in CG. The problem with computer graphics is really what you end up looking at it on. And, we're now, maybe, 10 or 12 places in the world can do film projection at any sort of scale. Everything's moved over to digital. But that means that, and then we're up against just the physical limitations of size of these files. And so, gosh, when we started out and moved into CG, everything was 8-bit. So we had, 256 colors. That was going to be it, But now we deliver 10-bit. I mean, that's only 1,024 colors. And your eye can perceive something like 10 million colors. And so also our eyes are horrible compared to like hawks. We don't see as sharp as they do. I don't know if you're familiar with starlings at all. They're kind of a drab, kind of brown bird or whatever. But in the bird world, because birds see way down into the ultraviolet light, their visible spectrum that they perceive is much, much wider. They are gorgeous. I mean, they're like right up there with peacocks. So I was fortunate enough, there was a fellow named Bryce Bayer, who was the guy from Kodak that came up with the original little format for these things that we've got in all our cameras now. And we worked with him. ILM had a scanner, one of the early ones. We worked in conjunction, going back to my note that we did a lot of stuff with Kodak. Kodak they made 2 chips. We had one, and one was back in New York. And the idea was how you could scan film so that you could put it into the CG world. We were going to just, start marrying those together. And Bryce was involved in that project. He had retired, but he still was around, and really pretty incredible guy. But and I don't know if you've ever heard the film debayering. So the Bayer part is him. And he said, and he based his, and sorry if I'm telling you stuff you already know, but
That's okay.
I know you've got a wide audience, but he based his red, green, and blue pattern on human eyes. And so it leans into the green. There's a bit more of those receptors, but it still is just an RGB thing. And these are dyes that are over basically the digital version of a silver halide. So all the receptors getting, it's going to do like darker or lighter. And they've gotten better with those. They can claim incredible ISOs now, but it's still exactly the same. You're into the same world of physics at some point where it's only going to perceive what it can. But back in the film days, I do believe that we just had a broader kind of gamut coming through with the dyes that were being used. They're very similar sort of setup. I know that, like for the scanner that we had a trilinear CCD array as opposed to this pattern on it. And it just allowed for just a better image. We could actually scan 16K. And this was back in 1987. And,
Wow.
now, 4K seems to be a big thing. I just worked on a project a year ago for this place called The Sphere in Las Vegas, where we're delivering 16K, but we still aren't really close to what you could do with film as far as the fine grain was. And part of the problem also, the way we shoot now with these digital cameras and that array in there. And now we've gotten into, shooting on stage on the volumes and LED screens. Well, those are little, checkerboard things. And there's a little checkerboard thing in your digital camera. And so when you shoot the digital camera at an LED screen, you're going to see moire patterns because, welcome to physics, and so that's the thing that bugs me about, even though I've been really involved in close to a lot of the development of the volumes, the thing that bugs me is they can never really be in focus. Now, what you could do is you come up with a different array in a camera, one that wasn't, so perfect. It was a bit more random, like, film grain sort of style, then yes, all of a sudden the moires go away. You shoot film on an LED screen, you will never see an array. It's, and so anyway, and I've gone down another rabbit hole, but Bryce had a really interesting solution for the technology at the time. And it's unfortunate that, and I do remember, again, I was never in the high level meetings, but things that I heard down, we went down this path with them with their scanner, and they did start Cinesite to, keep going with the idea. But as far as, I do remember hearing back that for little digital cameras, they decided it wasn't going to be a great resolution. At the best, it was going to be maybe 2K back at that time. And it was so inferior an image to what they could do on film, they decided, well, we're just not going to go down that path. And then they went bankrupt because people really didn't care so much about the fine. I mean, they like that. But when it got a little further along, all of a sudden it's like, why would I spend time on film when now the resolution has come up and they fixed the colors and I've got a broader color gamut? I'm not 8-bit anymore. I'm seeing more like I can see in the world. So, Kodak, they were right there and they kind of blew it.
Yeah.
That's my opinion, put it that way.
Yeah. So when George Lucas saw the wire removal and said this changes everything, do you think he realized? do you think he meant what we've seen since? I mean, did he foresee what was going to happen?
Yeah, I don't know right about that minute, but yes. And like I say, he was the benevolent dictator. And I do remember hearing, kind of come down as like, well, as far as our budget for the next year goes, he goes, well, just don't cost me any money, do whatever you can to figure things out. But he allowed things like the printer to happen, and he allowed things like the Kodak scanner to happen. It wasn't like that was without some cost on our side. And effects that's not where you make your money, not the effects house. What the effects go into that movie is going to make a bunch of money. And boy, he made a bunch of money on the toys. So again, he always was into technology. And I remember sitting in a meeting he had with a company, and we were only a couple hundred people at the time. It was right before episode 1. And he said, okay, we're going to make a movie. You're going to make my movie. He's going to pay for it. So he wasn't, answering to the studios to, cut things down. We're going to make my movie. He goes, it's not going to be Gone with the Wind. I'm not that type of director. It's going to be the movie that I want to make, but I really want to push the technology. And so he wanted to shoot digital, and he wanted to composite digital. And it made no common sense at that point to do it that way. He just really wanted to push this. And he was always more about the story and not nitpicking about little things. Things have evolved into now. And people get, there's a matte line over on the side over here. And George was more of the mode of, well, if you're looking over there, we've lost you because the story's over here. And he just wanted to push things on through. Dennis Muir was very much the same way. And we had these things we called CBBs, which could be better. but it told like George's story. And then we always tried to get back to our CBBs, and people like me that were technical geeks would try to fix everything. So you wouldn't see a matte line, or you wouldn't see a mismatch on something, or something that shouldn't have been there. But anyway, so he really pressed on the episodes that we got there. They tried to cut some corners. They went with Hawk lenses on the first go round, and because they were cheaper, and that presented no end of problems as far as aberrations go. So we're going to jump into a CG world with this perfect math, and some critter's going to run along a perfectly flat surface. And how do you then put that aberration into every CG camera that you're trying to do this render through? And so bailed on that idea. I went back to the good lenses on episode 2. But George was always there. And going back to the printer, when I got the printer going, it was 22 steppers. And when steppers run, you speed them up and slow them down. They make this weird, and I had 22 of them. And they would go, and I had this set up because I always wanted to check, and I could project back out onto this wall so you could see it pretty big. It wasn't like I was looking through a little thing, but it was about whatever. My point was just that I could go, here's home, and I could see it on a wall that was big, and it was like 15 feet across. And I could make all the motors go to make sure that everything was going to go back. And if I ran a pass and I wanted to make sure at the end everything was fine, I would hit this button and would do it. And George loved that because it made all these weird sounds. And he would bring folks by just to see this printer. He was very proud of, all the technology things that we go. And I could hit the button and it would go, and this thing is moving all over the place, and it popped right back. So I knew he took a great amount of pride in showing off the things that we were working on. And even the scanner, that was a big deal in its time. I remember Bill Gates coming around to take a peek at it, just because they knew it was going to be something in the future. But again, this is George's benevolence in allowing us to spend money that no sane person should have allowed us to do. But he was just so up about pushing, seemed very up about pushing the technology. So just an incredible place to work. Lord Peterson, he was the guy that started the practical model thing back on the original Star Wars. He had a 80th birthday a year ago, and he was talking about ILM in these times as kind of being like in Florence during the Renaissance. Is that it was and boy, you go back to Michelangelo, and I think when he did the Pieta, he was like 23. Like, what does a 23-year-old have any right to make something like that? And when I was maybe 30 when he did the Sistine Chapel. So Lauren's point was just that we were in this incredible opportunity where we could try things, and technology was coming along and just exploding, which was allowing us to do things that had never been able to do before. And we had these great relationships, like with Kodak, like Bill Tonder and all the motion control stuff that was going on, that it allowed us to try things that were, the other guy that was great about that was Bob Zemeckis. That guy was nuts about trying to just, we did so many things on like the Back to the Futures where they had a Panther dolly that was motion controlled that was not actually physically, it was just gravity was making it repeat to the same thing. So anyway, yes, George, I cannot speak highly enough of him for the sake of what he allowed us to do. And say what you want about, his directing style or his stories or whatever, but if I only had 2 good ideas and one was India and one was Star Wars, I could live with that. But so anyway, but yeah, massive fan. And he's, I always found him, I never had to report to him about money or anything like that. And I was always in the group that was kind of more solving problems. But I do say, okay, going back to another, John Knoll mentioned a shot in Indy and Last Crusade where he was talking about flying airplanes. And it was shot in San Rafael and Kerner, and it was a biplane. So there were these little wires that were part of the biplane. And it was going to be Sean Connery and Harrison Ford flying this thing. Okay, so you got a blue screen. Roger knows that's already a problem. And this was back in film days, right? So, and now one of the things that certainly has evolved is you just got to get a color back there. And with math, we can get rid of it. And AI is getting really good about making mattes as well. So it's just not the same thing. But back then, as an optical printer guy, I had a red filter. And if you didn't give me a blue color for the blue screen, there was nothing I could do about it. I would be I could maybe go off a quarter stop, a half stop at best, but it was chemistry and physics. And at that time, they were shooting on film. And so now you've got, Steven's shooting a thing and George is around, and there's a lot of money just standing there. And you know how schedules go, things kind of get behind. They were kind of trying, so they were rushing it, but they were kind of rushing it to try to get this thing done because of who they had there. And they just didn't quite get the blue screen right. And there was a fellow, Kenneth Smith, who was in optical. He was one of the supervisors there. And at that point, he'd won 2 Academy Awards. So this was a guy that knew what the hell he was doing, and he could not get a good extraction of that. He was the guy that would do all the wedges and then give it to a camera guy like me, and we would run these things out, and then he would try different filters and just sorting it out. And that's what I remember getting in this meeting, and George was just incredibly frustrated because these very expensive people for this, really high visible film that was coming out, and we couldn't pull off something like a blue screen in the time that we had. And I remember him saying, "You guys figure out how to do blue screen and then give me a call." And there was a fellow still there, Doug Smythe. And this time CG had moved along quite a bit, and we had gotten a lot better about doing things. Doug was the guy that did the warps on Willow. Anyway, Doug took it, and in his CG world, kind of going back to the Pixar days, he got a mat out of it. And these little thin wires could get put back in, and it looked perfect. And so that was kind of the follow-up years later about, okay, now here's another thing, we can fix this stuff. That also kind of screwed everybody going forward for, okay, now we know in CG we can fix lousy blue screens. But on the plus side, though, that meant that when you guys are out on set, you don't have to be as fastidious about it. You can get something, if we get a reasonable, smooth color back there, it can do stuff. But anyway, and the whole roto paint thing is such an evolution right now. And that is definitely an art that is going away on the practical side of things. I really do think, and this is kind of again, wandering all over the place, this is something that AI will really help us with and allow artists to spend time on art and not just doing stupid things about trying to fix a seam in something that you couldn't, get rid of on the day.
And where do you see the future of visual effects going? What do you see in the future?
Well, CG opens up so many worlds. One of the things I really love about now, like back when I got out of film school, I had like nowhere that I could show my films. I mean, I could make a print and get it into a film festival, but I was just this kid from Ohio. And they were expensive. A print of my film was about like my month's rent cost, so it was hard. And now with the internet, you can get stuff up, and millions of people can see things. So I think what's wonderful right now is that we're diving much more into storytelling. And, we've had pianos around for hundreds of years, but there's only so many Mozarts that show up. And I think what's going to happen now is that all the folks that were Mozarts that didn't have the opportunity, the technology was such, it was hard to get film, it was hard to, get the crews together and all that. There's opportunities now for these true storytellers to come and do their thing. And I've got 2 sons that foolishly have kind of followed me into the film business. So I'm kind of leaning into just helping them out on stuff right now. And also, I would like to write a bunch. And so I'm kind of leaning more into, as for just me personally, is those sort of films. But with everything I know about, take a step back, going back to the effects side of things, there is a company out there called Epic. Their main thing was this game called Fortnite, but they really leaned into real-time rendering. And it reminds me of early days of CG where, 2K, that's high res. We don't have the machines for that. So we make these little crops, and we chase these crops around that might have been like 500 by 500 pixels. And then we'd put them back together to make our 2K composite. Whereas now, I mean, one of the last projects we were making 16K composites, and it's just not, you just have to have the farm at that point for that. But my point was just that there are opportunities now with this real-time rendering as it gets better, more resolution, and starts to fit into what out of the cartoon world, that now effects that it would take forever to do or to make a change on are literally kind of in real time. And one of we did a test. Epic was trying to put together, they were going to do a series of films, and they were kind of sorting out some effects were going to come through ILM as far as putting the composite stuff together. And I worked with those guys a bunch. A lot of them came from ILM. And anyway, so I was part of that project. And they called me up and said, we have these things. When you go out and in my world or in the CG world, the big problem is rendering. It takes a long time. It takes big machines. And that's always been the case early on. And ILM's one thing because we had a good sized render farm, but the mom and pop shops just don't have that. So what they would do was they would render once, then try to fix whatever they could in the composite. And so then the way to get around that was to make all these different layers. We could have what we call PLOs, where per light images. So just this light is showing up in here, and there could be as many as you want. We had these things called AOVs, which were, I could just have the spec. I could just have, you name the light. It could, and there literally can be hundreds of these pieces that you could put back together. And so what that then allowed was for these mom and pop companies or just smaller effects companies to not have to go back and do the 3D render. Because you get out of 3D world and into my composite 2D world, all of a sudden everything gets way cheaper. You don't need as much memory. You certainly don't need as big machines. It goes way, way faster. Certainly the rendering on editing now is like, gosh, we did a setup where we had real time, I think there was like 8 layers. We were doing real time rendering of elements, which is crazy because it used to take, a day to run something. So Epic folks asked me, so what PLOs, what AOVs do you need? And I was like, well, I don't need any, because I could also need to do is to be able to know how to run your real-time engine. And rather than say, okay, I need to move this light behind this person, or I need to, have a bit more spec, I'll just run a new render. I'll set that thing up. And the thing that would take, and this is not to go into the weeds, but we've moved out of like CPUs on computers to GPUs, and those are just faster. And we're just in this evolution, but I really do feel it's very similar in now when we went from film to early CG to current CG to where it's going to go. And including things like the AI thing is, to me, one thing is really cool because it gets rid of a lot of the grunt work. And nobody really cares about that stuff. I mean, it can go down a horrible path for all sorts of other things, but just saying on the technical side, we're going to get rid of stuff. And it's very similar to me is like what we talked about earlier, where you make a film mistake, now you're starting all over. And if I can fix something in AI, why don't I don't care. I don't care that, the wire's gone, the wire's gone. Nobody cares about that. That's not impinging on anybody's artistry. And the roto paint artists that I know will be brilliant at using that technology, because it's something that has to get, the machines have to get caught, but it comes taught, but it comes back to their eye. And it's just like some of the earlier podcasts, talking about Roger's eye, just looking at something and knowing it's wrong. I mean, I remember you mentioning like lookups and stuff like that. And he looks at something and goes, that's just not right. Well, it's because he's got this incredible eye. He's, here's Michelangelo right there. But so there are folks like that at my level that are really good at doing those mundane things. And so again, my wandering point is I feel we're at such an opportunity now where I do believe the cameras will get better. You'll get broader spectrums. There won't be so many cutoffs. When we can composite in 64-bit. That's just crazy. We can't even see that. Hawks can probably get into that sort of realm, but when do Hawks ever go to movies? But
they're not part of the
so
box
I'm quite excited about it. And the other thing too, going back to the volumes, and we kind of jumped both feet into the full volumes. But gosh, I was trying to think the last time we did kind of a rear projection thing at ILM was on forever ago. But they jumped more into the volumes where there's 260 feet long and they're wide or whatever. But if you think about some years ago, I worked on Black Widow, and I was just helping out on that one. And there was one sequence in there where Scarlett Johansson's character is wrestling with her sister. They're fighting with her sister. And it's all about the fight. And in her apartment, there were some windows that were in the apartment, and they just had some green screen thing out there. And so we went through, and there had to be like 60 shots of this. And, it was on the day that they shot the stuff, and they just needed, through a green screen, I think it wasn't even really lit. It just, some green, but it was horrible. It was a horrible thing. If they had just put an LED screen back there, because it was going to be out of focus anyway, and it didn't have to be big. It could have been an 8x8, or 8x10 or something like that, and just to fill that space. All of a sudden, these 60 shots just went away. And so my point was just that it's like LEDs are wonderful for certain things. It's like giving you a whole opportunity. Granted, you can also, have these whole environments. But if you think about, I'm just going to do a patch here, or I'm just going to put a thing over there. I know earlier in some of your discussions, you talked about like, shooting people in cars. Why would you ever need to do that anymore out on live, when you can set up things with an LED screen, which is going to be out of focus anyways, because you're all concentrating on the conversation of the thing in the car. So, and then it could bounce like the car is doing. It can just look perfect, and nobody will ever know. So I just think that we have to figure out how to use the LEDs. The other problem with LEDs is, man, you talk about limited color. There's no great blacks in them. They're never going to be as great as the cameras are. There's no money to be made about having this incredible LED screen that's 200 feet long. It's just not. It's there for theatrical events. They're for putting up things. It's just, there's no money to be made. That I'm sure they know they could make them have a better dynamic range, and they certainly get better every year on things. But it's just like a new tool, figuring out how to use that new tool, and how to use that new tool with another tool that actually has the same array pattern as they do. So, and whatever. Anyway, but really interesting times. So, kind of summing it up, so many opportunities to actually get things out there that they didn't have before, but technology that we just have to kind of figure out how to use and get around the technical problems. But again, going back to my old pal Bryce Bayer, he had it sorted out how to get rid of this pattern of his that we're using. We just don't do it.
Yeah.
So it was, and part of the problem back then, he went with RGB because they couldn't get YCM colors, dyes right. It just was it was a problem. And I don't know why, but they just went this one route, and then we're kind of etched in stone on that. So.
How about the sphere? You were involved with Darren Aronofsky on
yes.
the sphere in Las Vegas. Actually, tell us about that.
Well, I've worked in a few films with Darren, and he's got to be one of my favorite directors. But it was interesting. He loves shooting on 16 millimeter, which is just crazy. For the sort of things, but he just does. This is his, and I worked with Maddie at Libitech anytime I worked with Darren, I've been working with him. But so, and Maddie, technically, you're just not going to get any better than him. So he kind of knows all that stuff. But anyway, so for the Sphere, MSG, Madison Square Garden, the company that owns that, MSG made a camera that would just fill the Sphere. And, lenses are lenses. And I remember going back, I think I mentioned in passing, I had done a short internship at this company that makes glass. And I remember talking to one of the scientists there, and he said, the problem with lenses is that they're not really solid. And the glass is not a solid. It's a liquid, and it's moving very slowly, but it's like, if you see really, 200-year-old windows, they look like they're kind of drooping. He said, the only way we can make perfect lenses that don't have aberrations would be in space, because gravity screws us up. And I'm sure they figured things out along the way or whatever. And certainly as you get into the more extreme versions of lenses, you get into 11s or 23s or whatever, it's such a fisheye sort of thing. It's just, you're really pressing physics at that point. And so they've got this great lens. They said it will capture like 18K, but only like 16K is really good. There's lots of aberrations and stuff like that. And there are ways that once you know the lens, because we have done this when we're trying to fit our animations into a particular lens, we will warp the computer graphic part of it to match the lens, and we warp it because we've taken images of grids and stuff and figure out where all those little aberrations are. So yeah, we can match that stuff. So there is a way for them to, kind of slowly undo what that problems that lens creates. But the stuff that they shot is incredible. And one thing that we did, Darren's based in New York, and we were, certainly working in San Francisco, one of the things we did was VR dailies, where we put on these VR headsets, and they had a model of the sphere, and the seats, and so you could look around with this face hugger on, and Darren could point to things. Oh, I don't like this here, or you should put this over here, and you could move around in that theater, so you could see it from different places. So you get off on the side. If you ever go to the sphere, and I mean, it holds 17,000 people. For the movies, they only sell like 4,000 or 5,000, but it's like in the center. It's still 4,000 or 5,000 people. It's like, come on, you don't need the stuff way off on the sides or whatever. If it gets warped, it just depends on. Again, you're into the problem of dealing with physics here. If you have a warped lens and you're looking way off on the side, well, it's going to look weird on the other side. But anyway, so what was great about the VR headset thing was Darren could show us things that he was concerned about. If you don't have something that has a strong geometric shape, you could put it over on the sides, and you just don't say. He's got these incredible shots of fish and like small insects and just all sorts of stuff that's not geometric, and it works kind of wherever, but it's a different way. Then you have to be aware of your storytelling, and I could see this being a nightmare for you, Roger. For like, you're used to looking right here. What if you had to look through your whole field of vision? So it's a kind of a wonderful problem. What it is being there is very much like being in a VR headset where you can look around and see everything, but you don't have a headset on. So things can go on behind you, and you look back there. We did some things where we purposely put stuff that's kind of coming over your head, or, he shot stuff. There's an incredible one where this giraffe comes in off the side and sticks its nose, on top of your head. So, but what to me the neatest thing about it is it's opening up an opportunity for kind of non-linear storytelling. And they were talking, and I can't say anything about it, but there's going to be some announcements relatively quick. They were talking, though, about how Darren's movie was made for that. And we started out letterbox, but it's a big, I mean, the screen is like 365 feet across. Our letterbox was 200 feet across. So it's still a massive image, but it wasn't the whole thing. So they were talking about how can you move other films, put other films into here? How could you expand out into that thing? And this film that Darren did was kind of a test of that. You use that lens, you're set. How do you do something where if you take an old film and try to put it in there, what do you do to expand it on out? And you can think about, I mean, obviously, ILM and Lucasfilm is, that would be a cool, something to put in there if you do it. And I know there's been talk about any number of things, and there's one that the first one is coming up in a month that they're going to do a big old talk about. But again, going back to my point about kind of non-linear storytelling, if you think about, what if something's going on over your shoulder and you look over there? It could easily be part of the story. What if you have this massive screen and you're having there's some argument going on between two people? Well, you kind of don't need to cut between the two anymore. You don't have to. You still could cut between the two and stay letterbox, or you could see the whole thing. Years ago, I went to a Britannia event, or a BAFTA event, the Britannia Awards, and I randomly sat at this table with this actor, and I cannot remember his name, but his acting has been in his family for like 400 years, literally. And he had just great, like, kind of family stories going back. And we got talking about nonlinear storytelling. And he said his, great whatever grandparents, back when it was not acceptable to be an actor, but people like to be entertained. So they would have a play that they were going to do, and they'd load all the stuff onto a wagon or two, and they'd have their costumes, and they would go to some village and they would put the play on. Great. The problem is now they're in a village, and if they're going to another village, they got to pack everything up. So it's easier if you could just stay there, but they only have so much stuff. So then the next night, they would tell the same story. So same props, same costumes, same kind of backgrounds, but from a different person's point of view. So he gave examples like, okay, first night, the dad's point of view. And he goes through this whole thing. Next night, the mom's point of view. And the mom might have been a minor character in the first one, but now all of a sudden you've got, and it could be the kids, it could be, whatever. You get the idea that you could tell the same story from different ways. And that's what I see the ultimate things for the sphere is that it's very much like you could play a game in there. It's a totally different, well, actually, it is set up that you could play games in there, like the CG games, but it's another opportunity where you could tell a story on so many other levels, and it's kind of mind-boggling. It's but it's like, well, what if I went into this room, into that room? And there are theatrical events that do this. You can go to places where you walk through the environment and the story is being told. There have been some things that Google did a thing where they put out a whole series of cartoon style things that you could look at in your phone, but you can move your phone around. The story was going to be here, but if you were curious about what was going on over there, you could just look that way with your phone. And it was spatially aware. So, and like I say, you could just do it at home. There was no special thing that you had to get. Anyway, to me, I see the sphere two things. One is kind of imagining, I suppose, old films that we see or have seen, different environments, or the same environment, but just expanded out into this kind of now in this world. How do you figure out how to, go close to whatever? It's an incredible spot. The other thing too there is they have, I think it's literally like 700,000 speakers to it. And so the sound is incredible. I worked on two other projects. One was for the Grateful Dead, or what's left of the Grateful Dead, and the other was for U2 when they did their shows there. And there's obviously really the Grateful Dead, I think, is kind of easy. Those folks coming in are going to be a little toasted anyway, walking in. So you can do a lot with the imagery. But we did some very specific kind of storytelling things. We start on their house in Ashbury, go up to the sky, and come back to their house in Ashbury. And so it was a way of telling that part of the story, but just in a different venue. And I'm really excited about it because I see so many opportunities about it's kind of a different person's point of view of the same story. As far as things going in the future, it's like just embracing this technology and embracing now that the sphere is crazy big, but the same idea could work for a much smaller venue where you had 1,000 people in it, kind of a more normal size thing. I know there was an effort that went on. There are some theaters where there's like some screens on the side where you could kind of fill things out a bit. We did some of that where whatever's going on, if it's a city, well, now we'll add city on the side. And it was kind of a little attempt to move into this world where it's a bit more immersive. But just that idea where, and I do believe that storytellers that's the crux of it. And then folks that get that visual on. So like DPs in particular, you're going to, if you want to make it scary, that's lighting stuff. That's like, what's the look going to be? How do we follow this thing around? So I see any number of like kind of the jobs or whatever aren't going to change. It's just an opportunity to expand on this idea. And I don't know, I find it just fascinating. And I really do think it's very, very similar to the jump from film and all those restrictions into CG. And I don't think the computer graphics has done they're not perfect yet by any means. So there's a lot of, and I've, again, listened to a number of your things, and yeah, all the things that you are concerned about, just like, it just looks weird, or, well, yeah, because we're not there yet. We don't have things that, hawks or eagles would like to look at. We have things that kind of, 12-year-old kids that play games are fine with, but the people that are a bit more visually sophisticated just don't think look right.
Well, great. This has been great.
Very good.
Yeah.
That's a very good capper.
Now I want to see a movie that a hawk would like. Well, thank you, Jon, for this. This is great.
Oh,
yeah, it's great.
It's really, really wonderful talking to you folks. And I really am a massive fan of the stuff that you guys work on. So,
thank you.
But, and I'm always kind of felt that just my position, being comp soup in particular, we're the last stop, after us. If we can't, it's going to go in the movie. It's going to go to an editor. The best he can do is just, cut things out. Yeah. But it's always fun talking with the DPs and trying to get the sense of what they're trying to do and being able to fix things for them. And I guarantee you there is nothing that we can't fix. It's time and money. That's really what it comes down to. But having people that visually understand what they're looking at to make it good for you. But anyway, this has been a real treat.
Great.
Great.
Yes, thank you
Thanks
very
so
much.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.